Construction makers.
Tarkir Dragonstorm is coming out soon.
Yes, it's coming out April 11th.
So yeah, before the set comes out, we thought we'd go over the mechanics and discuss what we think about them, maybe some of the history about the mechanics that may have influenced these ones, and sort of generally our thoughts about the set.
I think most channels are probably going to be evaluating things based off of like power level or skill level, viability in their various commander decks. I think we're probably going to be viewing things a little bit differently. I'm sure we're going to touch on power level, but it's probably primarily going to be looking at it through the lens of game design.
And mostly we're going to be just looking at mechanics, not necessarily individual cards. So let's get started.
All right, so looking over the mechanics list, the first one we have for the Abzan being green, white, and black. We have Endure. What Endure is Endure with a number at the end, so I'll just say X in place of the number. So this is Endure's X. Put X +1/+1 counters on this thing that endures, or create a XX white spirit creature token. So there's other things that trigger Endure. It's not just when it enters, but there's Unoffensa, Unyielding Lineage. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, Unoffensa endures too. So yeah, on death trigger, there's...
Oh, that's crazy, actually. It's only this creature that gets the counters, right? It's not put +1/+1 counters on anything?
Yeah, no. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, in reference to the creature, or create a 2/2 white spirit creature token.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so there's an attack trigger, there's a couple enter triggers. Yeah.
Okay, so Endure X, some number, and then there's a trigger, either enters or attacks or something dies. Well, this is like, I guess kind of bread and butter Abzan. They're usually connected to token creatures and or +1/+1 counters. So there's sort of like, a gathering of that flavor. I kind of wonder how often you would use the +1/+1 counter version of this, because like the additional body usually ends up just being better, right? It's like the same amount of power, but instead you have it in two different places. So if like you're attacking with both of them, I guess if your opponent has a creature that's large, maybe you would want to also have a creature that's larger.
Yeah.
So you might take the +1/+1 counters. I do feel like usually the option here is going to be the token. But it does have a certain amount of modularity, which is nice. There's at least some variance in choosing which one of these two options you will have.
Yeah.
It feels fine.
I think I'm kind of torn on the modularity. I feel like this is a new, I think this is just an inevitability of, Magic being around for 30 plus years. But the fact that most mechanics at this point seem to be leaning into this sort of modular or modal form, where most mechanics end up being made that it seems like it's usually like, well, you can do this thing or you can do this thing. I think it makes more sense for multicolored things that usually like different colors serve different functions. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of like blah about it.
Yeah, like it doesn't feel particularly black in any way, which is kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because Abzan's black, green,
It's
white.
pretty much just white, green.
This feels like white, green.
Yeah.
I don't get a whole lot of like a black flavor from it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's interesting. I don't think it's particularly exciting, but I don't think it's bad necessarily. There's not really a lot of cruft.
Certainly not the One Ring.
Right. Or no. The ring tempts you.
Yeah.
Or max speed, or at least it's not doing anything egregious like that.
Next we have Flurry, which is for the Jeskai, which is red, white, and blue. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, do a thing. So this is a thing that we've seen in cards before at this point.
Yeah.
Quite a few times. They've really been leaning a lot into this sort of, if it's the second time that you've done a particular thing, then this triggers.
So I will say, I think the other versions of this that we've seen are when any player casts their second spell this turn, and those ones have been particularly good, like Ledger Shredder is the first one that comes to mind. But this is just you, right? It's not
whenever
any player.
you cast your second spell each turn.
Right, which feels a bit more limited.
Yeah.
And it's limited to just, that's the only trigger, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
It's not, they don't change the number of spells, no kind of
now, the only thing
granularity.
that's consistent is that it's only whenever you cast your second spell each turn, and then it's a unique effect afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's one that's like, it's basically like Lightning Helix, so it deals 2 damage to each opponent, and you gain 2 life.
Okay.
So,
I mean, it is additional value for the spells that you're casting. This does fall into a particular category of card that is questionable in terms of its value. It's also an enhancer, right?
Yeah.
So these cards don't do the thing on their own. It requires you to build your deck in a particular way, and it requires you to play those cards after you've played this card. And sometimes your cards don't line up that way. Sometimes this is just a creature. And my assumption is it's probably an overcosted creature, right? So
I actually think that what they're leaning towards is something a little bit closer to Like if I'm looking at a Devoted Duelist here, Devoted Duelist is a 1 and a red with haste. It's a 2/1. So already a 1 and a red with haste as a 2/1 is something that it's like, yeah, that's probably something you'd already put in.
Yeah.
But on top of that, it has its Flurry ability, which this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent when you cast your second spell. So it feels a little bit more like what they're trying to do is create less dead draws in mid to late game for aggro decks, which I've seen. There's been a few cards that have been doing this that have also been in aggro decks lately, where it's usually something that is generally good, but if you happen to be able to push into the later game, you have some sort of an advantage that you can either spend your mana on something and get more value out of an individual card if it's later on in the game.
You're sort of tacking on a what's that card called? There's like a lava dart or something, right? Or something that deals 1 damage.
Oh,
right?
okay.
So you're sort of tacking that on to whatever spell you're playing after this. But again, that's an enhancer, right? So it requires you to have played this card and then have the spells to play after it, and it's 2 spells. So
it'd be you play this and then
the next spell.
thing.
Oh, and it's okay. So it's any spells, right? Creatures, whatever. Okay, okay, that's like
it's
fine.
It's easier to pull off,
for some reason I was thinking of prowess, where it was like, I think it's only instant or sorceries, but this is any spell. Okay, it's fine.
It's fine. Yeah. It's not going to see, I think, a lot of play. It's going to be probably primarily around limited. There might be something viable in standard.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's going to be like one or 2 cards of this that have been pushed enough to play in standard. The one that you mentioned might be good enough to see play in some burn decks. Also, once like certain things rotate, this stuff could end up being good at some point. So.
Right. The next one is Renew. This is for Sultai, which is blue, green, and black. Mm-hmm. Renew is pay a certain amount of mana or pay some sort of a cost, then exile this card from your graveyard and do a thing. And I think all of them activate only as a sorcery.
This is kind of in the lineage of Flashback and Unearth, in that it's like, okay, well, this is in your graveyard, so pay some mana, do a thing.
Karsi Revenant is an example here. It's 1 and 2 black, flying Death Touch lifelink, and it has Renew, 2 and a black. Exile this card from your graveyard, put a flying counter, a death touch counter, and a lifelink counter on target creature. Activate only as a sorcery. The majority of them put counters on them. So Naga Fleshcrafter, exile, put a +1/+1 counter on target non-legendary creature you control. That one's cool. Each other creature you control becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it sounds like this is actually more similar to Scavenge, in that with Scavenge, you would get the +1/+1 counters equal to the power of the creature that you scavenged. If it's in your graveyard, you pay the scavenge cost. You put +1/+1 counters on your creatures, right? This is like, okay, well, now you're getting the abilities of the creature, or additional abilities or whatever based on.
Yeah, usually it's something that's somewhat related to what the creature does when it's alive or out on the field.
Yeah.
And other examples like Agent of Kodis is just, it only has its renew ability, and you'd put 2 +1/+1 counters on a target creature. So
is it a 2-power creature?
It's 2/1.
Okay.
1 and a blue for 2/1.
That's weird because that's basically just scavenge, right? That's a little strange.
I don't know.
But it's fine. I mean, like, what's interesting about them is a lot, like, basically anything that gives you extra value out of the graveyard is almost always really good, just because it's basically like drawing an extra card. If you're
going to be having any sort of mill strategies be prevalent, I think it's just going to end up feeding into that.
Yeah, or even just like, okay, you played this as a creature, it dies, you still get value out of it out of the graveyard. So that's always good.
I think it's funny because I do think that, like you said, it's similar to Flashback, but I think then Flashback has been so popular, they've definitely done a lot of different variations of a Flashback-like ability. And I think it makes sense because it kind of makes, in a way, milling feel a little bit, it's almost like welcoming to new players. Whereas I feel like previously the idea of like self-mill was not super intuitive, I think, to some players, but sort of leaning into that idea. It's almost like a signpost mechanic showing like, oh, well, if you can get this into your graveyard, you can still do something, maybe even do something stronger if it's in your graveyard.
Yeah, well, and the other thing that's interesting too, other card games have ran into this problem where they basically are like, okay, well, you need to draw more cards in order to have more stuff to spend your mana on each turn, because it feels good to spend your mana on something. It feels pretty bad if you're like stalled out and like the game's still going and you're just drawing one card a turn and you draw a land or something, right? So
it's always a problem of having to make sure that you have a variety of what to spend your mana on.
Right, and you really don't want to lean on card draw to try to like rectify this problem, because if you do, you start making the game too consistent. So having these kind of modular abilities, reusable mechanics, right? Having these reusable mechanics gives you something to spend your mana on instead of having to draw more cards to have more stuff to play.
It's spending mana twice for one card as opposed to spending mana for 2 cards. Right?
Yep. creatures with activated abilities are similar.
The next mechanic, this one I feel like has been getting a lot of attention, is Mobilize. This is the Mardu mechanic, which is white, red, and black.
Gavin here from the editing room. Slight correction on Mobilize. We should have said that this is Mobilize X, where X is the number of 1/1 attacking red warrior creature tokens that you get. Not a single warrior token that is an XX. Okay. Back to the video.
Mobilize is whenever this creature attacks, create a tapped and attacking XX red warrior creature token. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. And it's usually Mobilize X, so whatever that number is.
This one so far seems the most out of the box powerful. Depends on synergies for the other ones, but this one definitely is like, okay, well now you have a creature that, you know, I don't know, it's a 2/2 and it attacks with Mobilize 2. You're suddenly attacking for 4, and then if you're using any kind of anthem effects or anything, that you can buff that very easily for aggro strategies. There's also one card in particular that stands out for CEDH.
Yeah, Voice of Victory. Voice of Victory is Mobilize 2, so when it attacks, create 2 tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature tokens, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step, and your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, and it's 1 and a white for a 1/3.
This one's good for multiple reasons. One is that Grand Arbiter is very good in the format because it makes it so you can attempt to win the game on your turn if you get it in play.
Technically not the same level as Grand Arbiter, just because it's not abilities.
It doesn't stop abilities, just stops spells. Yeah. But then the flip side of this is that it's also great with Tymna. So when you attack, you're going to get extra creatures to deal damage with so that you can draw more cards with Tymna.
Mobilize feels like a good way of sort of having this in-between mechanic. One, it's adjustable. They seem to be going that route with a lot of their new mechanics, having mechanic name X. So that they can adjust it. They don't want another Cascade scenario, so instead they're going to do Discover.
Let's put a limit on it, right?
Yeah. So, but what I like is that it sort of ends up creating it's basically Myriad in a way, but it's adjustable Myriad.
Yeah.
And so it's something that I can definitely see this having some viability in Standard, in Limited, and in Commander because of you being able to sort of bring out all these tokens to attack other people at multiple times.
Well, and I like that there's sort of some extra knobs here to work with in terms of you're creating extra creatures that then can be sacrificed for other aristocrat strategies, or there's a lot of
this has the most sort of connective tissue between other things that could trigger it.
Interesting plugs to plug in other cards too. The best part though is that people are going to be putting your warrior token into play a bunch.
That's true.
Yeah,
a self-plug.
Oh, look at
That's right. Yeah.
So Forrest has his warrior token for this set,
and somehow that ended up being the most notable card that I worked on for the set. I worked on 3 cards. I worked on a warrior token. I worked on Monastery Messenger, and I did the art for the Abzan Mana Dork. That's not the name, but that's basically what it is. Next, we have Harmonize. This is for Teamer. That's green, blue, and red. So Harmonize is Harmonize, pay a certain amount. You may cast this card from your graveyard for its Harmonize cost. You may tap a creature you control to reduce that cost by X, where X is its power, then exile this spell. So another flashback-like ability, but with Convoke.
Yeah, we basically have stapled Convoke onto Flashback, which is cool. I mean, Convoke is an ability that is quite powerful. Flashback is an ability that's quite powerful. So putting the two together, you got your peanut butter and my chocolate, you got your chocolate and my peanut butter. So
now, that being said, though, Convoke is individual. It's 1 mana per creature that you tap, right?
Yeah, it is slightly different than Convoke because this is based on the creature's power.
Yeah.
I am wondering how exactly this fits into green, blue, red. It doesn't feel like it embodies those colors particularly. I suppose green does some amount of graveyard recursion.
Green does a little bit of graveyard recursion. It does seem a little weird. Creature's power, I think, makes sense for green and red, I think.
Yeah.
But blue is also like...
Well, blue had some cards with Disturb from back in like Innistrad and stuff. But this one's a little weird for me flavor-wise, but that's okay.
I mean, it makes sense if, in particular, in a limited format, you want to make sure that you have certain cards that mechanically will cross over between each other. Yeah. And so it makes sense if this is half the colors, 2/3 of the colors of Sultai. And so if you want to connect it to any sort of graveyard connection, it makes sense that you want to use something like that. I do think it's at the cost of it feeling like it maybe fits that color combination. which is a bit of a bummer. Notable card for Harmonize is a new one called Nature's Rhythm, which is basically a Chord of Calling, Green Sun Zenith.
Yeah, it's
Same
a
thing.
creature tutor that you pay X into it to search for a creature that costs X or less, right?
Yes, but with its Harmonize, you can do it again for X and 4 green mana.
Right, so you can search up some kind of powerful creature, and then you can
tap it
tap
turn.
it to flashback your. It'd be really funny to use that with like Death Shadow or something. Death Shadow is like a 1 mana 13/13. So you're like, oh, let me go get this 1 mana creature and then tap it to get 13 extra mana for the X or whatever.
Isn't it 13/13? Doesn't it go down?
Yeah, you'd have to be at a certain life total to get the third. Yeah, but it's
that would be a good combo though. Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
Funny. Huh. Next one. So we're getting out of the traditional sort of mechanics on cards and getting into
the ones that are related to the clans, right?
Yeah,
we're moving to just the more generic.
Yeah. So there's a new sort of mechanic called Omen. Omen is essentially like adventure cards from Eldraine. So basically, you usually will have, I think it's on other things, but usually a creature that one side will have its Omen ability. That's its sort of adventure ability, like in Eldraine. That's an instant sorcery, some other sort of an effect. And then the right side, you'll have the creature effect. So, but the difference between being on an adventure is you use it, you cast it for that. It's on an adventure, so it's an exile, and you can cast it from exile. Omen's ability is you use that ability, and you will shuffle the card back into your library. In a way, you're creating the possibility to infinitely get these cards.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, if you could mill most of your library and then you can like reoccur this spell.
Yeah,
that like is an edge case.
I know. I don't think it's possible, but I think that's interesting that they're creating a scenario that could be a possibility.
Right. I think that this mechanic's fine. It's interesting because like you said with the adventure stuff from Eldraine, you're kind of getting both of the cards in that way, so it's less of a like a choice. So the variance for the card here is now I'm either getting the spell or the creature. I'm not getting the spell and the creature. Even though it could I could shuffle it in and it could come back and I could then cast the creature if I wanted to. So at least this feels more like a meaningful choice. It's kind of similar to how like back in the day they made it so damage didn't go on the stack anymore, so that you weren't getting both the damage that the creature would deal and then being able to sacrifice it to a sacrifice effect. So it's like, okay, well, let's go ahead and make sure that people are actually making a choice between these things, which also probably means that they can make both halves of this card more powerful because you only get one.
Yeah, the fact that it can shuffle back into your deck is very interesting. And I'm curious if there's anyone that can maybe figure out some shenanigans with that, because I feel like it is a mechanic that's ripe for that, possibly. In particular, there's one Meringue River Regent here that it has Marange, Marange,
like a meringue.
Yeah,
pie?
like a meringue pie. Yeah, it looks like a meringue pie actually.
The card does.
Yeah, you can.
Wow.
You can't see it right now, but
I believe you.
Yeah, just pull it up.
I think you're definitely not lying to me right now.
I'm not.
Okay.
So it's. Omen ability is Coil and Catch, 3 and a blue, instant, draw 3 cards, then discard a card. So I think it's kind of interesting. Like, obviously, it wouldn't be able to draw itself. You're probably going to be, I'm assuming, probably
you can play
activate
multiple copies.
But you can play multiple copies, so yeah, you could chain into it and stuff like that. Obviously, costs a lot of mana.
What would be fun and limited, though, is to draft as many of these as you can, and then that way you're just constantly, like, you just keep, you like never run out of them, which is like funny. I don't know.
Right.
Could be silly. Because in limited, you can play as many copies of a card as you draft.
I think the only thing that kind of is strange for me is like it's so close to being on an adventure.
Yeah.
Even the interface is like basically the same.
Yeah, the card looks the same. Yeah.
That it's, I don't know. It's
that's actually a little worrying to me with the card frame. Is that like it looks so similar to on an adventure that I'm worried that players might think it works that way just because it looks so similar.
And because the reminder text is at the end saying that, well, you shuffle this in afterwards.
No.
There's been already some cases where there's a lot of abilities that are starting to say only activate this ability as a sorcery, only activate this ability once per turn, or triggers once per turn. And when it's at the very end of you reading the whole thing, it's like you get really, really excited and you go, oh, that's what it does. Okay. And then you just do the thing.
Then it's like a huge letdown when you get to the end of the line.
Yeah.
Or it was like sorcery speed. You go to cast it as an instant, and then you go, nope, can't do that.
Yeah.
Like, oh, let me take that back.
And on top of that, I mean, when you get into the alt art, it's starting to not even have the reminder text for Omen.
And the alt art almost is the one that looks even more similar.
It looks even more like Eldraine.
Yeah.
So
that's almost like a user user experience problem more than anything else, but like that's still a bit of a bummer.
Yeah, I don't know. It's things like this that obviously we could only speculate, but it does make me a little concerned that I worry that maybe there's too much like digital testing happening.
That's come up before.
Yeah.
That if designers are testing digitally, they're not having to track this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's also like there's also a weird bias that can happen because like you're just so used to doing it that way. Like you're like, oh, I'm immersed in this particular set with these particular cards. You kind of become blind to a potential mix-up like that.
So the next one is Behold. Behold is effectively kicker in most cases. So the first one they showed was Sarkhan, Dragon Ascendant. When Sarkhan enters, you may behold a dragon. If you do, create a treasure token. And beholding a dragon is essentially you choose a dragon that you control or reveal a dragon card from your hand. And there's other use cases, though, in that Caustic Exhale is 1 black, and it's an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, behold a dragon or pay 1. So that's the usual sort of, it's cheap black removal that costs you something. But in order to actually cast it, you have to behold a dragon or pay extra mana.
So it's behold or kicker in that instance.
Right. Yeah.
This mechanic is interesting. I kind of cringe a little bit because I think that the naming is like funny. Like it's a little too silly. Like it's fine. I don't know what else you would have called this.
I'm kind of torn on it. I actually like the naming.
Behold, a dragon. It's like, okay. Like, it's a little funny, but
I think, I don't know. I think that behold in combination with dragons is like kind of cool, but I'm worried like if it's expandable, right? So it's like behold a goat, and it's like okay,
or behold a land, or
and it's like then it's gonna get a little funky.
Yeah, I think so there's a long history of mechanics that do this kind of thing. There's one from back in Dissension, which was called Forecast,
right?
Which is kind of like this.
You reveal the card itself.
You reveal the card itself, and it was it was not a great mechanic.
I think Chroma is probably closer.
Well, Chroma was what turned into Devotion.
No, but Chroma was originally that you reveal cards.
Some of them were. Not all of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was one of the problems with Chroma, is that some of them were reveal a certain number, some of them was how many in play. Devotion normalized it to just in play, which was a much better decision. It's good that this always works the same way, like we said. And the other part of it was something you brought up that I hadn't thought about, which was the archetype, like the sort of archetypalness of this mechanic.
Yeah, so if they're going to lean into sort of these tribal archetypes, that they end up really leaning into archetypal powers. Having kindred synergies or having specific types is what locks more powerful effects for players. So this is what Yu-Gi-Oh does with its archetypes. So Yu-Gi-Oh leans all in on archetypes, where basically the only effective decks are some that take up a particular archetype and say, you can have some of the best draw spells, you can have some of the most consistent tutors, but only if you are in these specific archetypes and only if you tutor or draw for these specific archetype cards.
Yeah, and we made a video a long time ago talking about like parasitic design and how we're basically seeing that as kind of part of the future for creating new play patterns in Commander. And the issue is that like when you first start out with any kind of a new mechanic, if it's too parasitic, there's no way to get enough copies of those cards that anybody could make any kind of meaningful Commander deck out of it, because Commanders are singleton decks. So it's actually a pretty big problem for creating unique play patterns. It's going to take a long time for them to create a new kind of archetype in Commander, but this does give them a way to create sort of some new play patterns within tribal decks, right? So like you're playing dragons, you're playing elves, you behold, it doesn't even have to necessarily be like a creature theme, right? It could be similar to Landfall, where lands matter. It could be behold an enchantment. And suddenly that's something that can work more powerfully in a deck that is themed around whatever the behold part of it is.
Right.
Which is cool.
Yeah. And I think that, we're actually seeing this, and I'm curious if Tarkir is sort of a bit of a signpost, I guess, for maybe where the future of how they're going to be designing sets goes, where this seems to be, obviously Tarkir, it makes sense to lean into dragon themes, but there have been a few cards that seems like they're really leaning into dragons, but also locking certain effects behind dragons, not just encouraging sort of the dragon / anti-dragon play pattern.
Like the Mox Jasper works that way
too. Yeah. And I think that it's interesting because, there is a possibility that, are we going to see another set in the future that is leaning more into merfolk or leaning more into these other sort of tribal synergies?
Well, it's not like we haven't seen stuff kind of like this before, right? Where, we have like Mox Opal, which is with Metalcraft, right? So we have a lot of artifacts. Affinity for artifacts is the same way, right? So these kinds of like archetypes do exist in Magic. It's interesting to see more cards be built around that idea. So we might get like some really solidified play patterns that way, which is, I think, maybe good or bad. It depends. Where you end up with like an Aristocrats deck or something that just has like, oh, here's just all the best Aristocrats cards, which is kind of already a thing. There's not a whole lot of slots to play with there. And the more of that kind of thing we get, the more slots get filled out in particular archetypes in Commander, but that does then open more room potentially for different archetypes.
And it also means that it can cleanly be defined as that, where right now you could play Dragon, you could play Dinosaur, and you'd be like, well, these play pretty similarly, but if they really lean all in on like, well, it's only Dragon, then you can find, okay, if that's what Dragon feels like, then let's make this other archetype feel much different to that, because they now have a sort of baseline.
Rather than everybody choosing like, oh, what's just the generic best kill spell or generic best draw spell.
Now it's what are the dragon spells?
Right, what's a kill spell that feels like a dragon kill spell?
Yeah. So the last two mechanics aren't unique to the set. We have monocolor hybrid mana, and we have Surveil.
So the hybrid mana is just basically you can pay a color, or you can pay 2 colorless. This is something we've seen before, way back in Shadowmoor, with like Reaper King. I think maybe just Scarecrows generally, now that I think about it, but whatever. And then Surveil. We've seen Surveil a lot.
100 times.
100 times.
1,000 times.
It's a good mechanic. It's fine. Works out. It's power crept scry, so...
and when they're announcing that Surveil is now what we call an evergreen mechanic. So they're now officially making Surveil evergreen, which at this point makes sense. We just saw it at Murders of Krarlov Manor. And
the Surveil lands are really good. I mean,
yeah.
It's a good mechanic. It is a little weird that like it's power crept scry in that
I was gonna say it's basically better scry.
You get extra value off dumping something in your graveyard. It works well with the set. The set has sort of the Graveyard Matters theme with Sultai and Teamer. So
it makes sense to include it. But at this point, it does seem like there's an awful lot of support for graveyards, and
it is a little worrying.
Everything else, I don't know. I mean, even technically the tokens, the Mardu tokens, can lean a lot into graveyard, but it seems like because technically, if they die at the end, if you have something that triggers,
dies effects,
have to be a token that triggers it, but still.
All right, so that's Dragonstorm, Tarkir.
Yeah,
Dragonstorm.
Tarkir Dragonstorm.
Dragons
the set.
It's seems fine. I mean, overall, nothing's like really knocking my socks off in terms of anything super unique mechanically, but nothing's also really like, ooh, that seems terrible. So
this feels very much like Timmy's Galore.
The dragons,
and
and honestly, maybe that's partially why the mechanics are sort of taking a back seat here. Is that like dragons sell the set? So
that's true.
You don't necessarily need to do anything crazy mechanic wise.
Yeah, I also feel like in general, people have seemed fairly positive about like the Behold mechanic, and I think that on top of the embracing of the whole dragon thing and dragon themes of it, I think it makes a lot of sense. That in tandem with Call of the Spirit Dragon or whatever it's called, Dracogenesis. These big giant dragon spells I think are very exciting. Big cool cards to help sell the feeling and themes of the set. Dragons.
Everybody loves dragons. Thanks for listening to us talk about Tarkir Dragonstorm. If you like this video, give us a like, and you can subscribe. Also, if you want to join our Discord to continue the discussion, you can find a link to that in the description below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye, Timmies.
Bye.